Hello and welcome to another Tuesday Talk with Ruby Reese. My name is Killian. I am co-founder at Ruby Reese and dognutrition.ie, and I will also be your host. This week, speaking about a topic that we've actually already had on the podcast, and with someone that we've also already had on the podcast, just two separate pieces of the puzzle. So I suppose I wanted to start this episode off a little bit talking about how certain topics we feel are underrepresented in our community, in our little Irish dog community in particular, and some of them are quite important. And I think there's a couple of reasons behind that. I think there are some topics that we just find difficult to speak about. There are some topics that we love to talk about, and that, puppies being a huge one. We all love puppies, and lots of our listeners, I know, love listening about puppies, and it's all so wholesome and lovely. But there are topics as well that I think our community really does need to speak about, and they're also the more challenging topics, the ones that lots of people have maybe private opinions about, but not many people like speaking publicly about. So I think sometimes it's worthwhile digging up some of these topics, and I know some of you are actually in talks with us about bringing up kind of topics that are difficult to speak about in the public sphere, and I'm really excited for digging into those juicy topics, because like I say, I think those are the ones that we really need to talk about. So yeah, I suppose being brave and not sticking with the tried and tested is good. So the topic that we're bringing up again for a second time on this podcast is all about teenage dogs, and I think we could talk about the teenage phase for dogs with 100 different people and still learn something new. So it's not that we've done a bad job in the past. In fact, we've a brilliant other episode on teenage dogs that if you like this one, you can go back and listen to that one too. And we're also, I mentioned, speaking with someone that's been on the podcast before, and that's Anne Rogers from Ed. And equally, with the topic, I could speak with Anne about 100 different things and definitely learn something new. That's an absolute guarantee. So it's an absolute delight to have Anne back on the podcast. But I think in general, just talking about our past episodes, we see that loads of you are going back and watching older episodes. So we thank you for that, because I think most of the episodes that we've done in the past will definitely stay quite current for a couple of years to come. So it's definitely worthwhile if you're planning a flight or a long trip or whatever, long drive in the next couple of weeks and months. You can download some of the episodes if you're interested in any of the topics. There's quite a bank of topics building up every single Tuesday. And actually, talking about that, a brilliant example is the chat that I had with Anne, all about breed-specific legislation. So this was in and around the legislation that at the time was coming in and around the XL bully breeds, and it was a brilliant eye-opening conversation about whether breed can predict behaviour and things like that. So absolutely worthwhile listening back to our back catalogue, our building library of topics. So without further ado, I am going to invite you now to listen in to the chat that I had with Anne. Anne, welcome back to the podcast. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you.
Good.
Would you do us the pleasure of introducing yourself for anyone that doesn't know who you are?
Yeah, of course. So my name is Anne Rogers, and I'm from a company called Ed Ireland, which is animal education. I have to explain that every time. And we deliver bespoke educational services to everybody, really, to professionals, to hobbyists, to guardians, the whole gamut. Particularly interested in dog behaviour, but we talk about all aspects of health and welfare in animals and animal-human relationships as well.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. That was very concise.
Yes.
So we picked a really interesting topic to chat about this week, and it's one I think that is very important to talk about. But Why do you think it's so important to talk about the dog's teenage phase?
Because adolescence is one of the most impactful phases for the human canine relationship, right? And we might even
Mhm.
say that about that the same for teenage human children and their caregivers as well, that it's a really impactful stage. I'm sure the people who reared us, Killian, would have a tale or two about our teenage years. That would
Turbulent,
Yes,
you'd call
yes,
it.
yeah. I was going to go for something more diplomatic, but yeah, okay, we can go turbulent. That probably fits too. And what's really interesting is that dogs and other mammals too, we have found go through the exact same brain and body changes that human children do. So it's likely they're going to be experiencing the same challenges, very diplomatic, the same turbulence that human children do. And we even have a tiny, teeny little bit of data that's looked at the similarities between caregiver and human teenagers and guardians and canine teenagers, and there's lots of similarities between those two relationships across species, across the species divide.
Okay, so that makes a lot of sense. It's definitely maybe a keystone kind of period
For
in a
sure.
dog's life. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And also we're starting to view one of the kind of obsessions I suppose I have in relation to canine adolescence is that we spend a lot of time talking about puppies and particularly talking about puppies from 0 to 3 months of age, which I'm not saying isn't important. It is important, but we're now recognizing that this adolescent phase is probably similar in that it's also a sensitive period of development for behavior. So that means things that happen to dogs during this phase during this when I say phase it sounds like it's something that's just as transitional and not a big deal, but what we really mean is a period of development there. So I'll just clarify
Mhm.
that and that I'm not
Yeah.
relegating it in importance, but that sorry, choking as well. But so it's important that we recognize that we're dealing with individuals where anything that happens to them at this time is very impactful on their behavior later on. So all of the stuff that happens a dog during this adolescent phase is likely to have big impacts on their adult behavior, particularly in relation to their ability to cope with stress and change and social challenge. And that's all happening during that period when the brain is developing in this way. So yeah, it's important. Just
Mm.
as important as that early puppy phase. So we tend to kind of get our puppies through that first few months, dust off our hands and think, oh, job is done, and we just go on. But actually, we still have the bulk of the work to do because we have to get through adolescence now with just as much effort and kind of focus on it, I suppose.
So the message here really is we should be taking this phase even a little bit more seriously than we currently do.
For sure, yeah. And one of the things that you were talking about was, are we really talking about this enough or talking about this in the right way, I suppose? And I would say that we're probably not. And maybe in our bubble, amongst training and behavior professionals, we recognize it as something that's very impactful and we realize the challenges. But I'm not sure that the wider dog guardian public realize that, and they might think that this it's not normal, that there's something wrong here, that there's something wrong with their dog, that there's something wrong with what they're doing. And actually it is normal, and there is a kind of an yeah there's things we can do, but there is a little bit of an element of we just kind of have to survive this, and we'll get through the next couple of years, and then we'll be a bit happier. And so there is a little bit of an element of just surviving it for now.
Yeah.
We'll get better.
And maybe we should have a look at what's going on really biologically as well. What's happening in a dog's brain during this phase, and how does it affect their behavior?
So much stuff is happening. So when they're fully their brain is the structure of their brain is established and built by the time they're about 6 weeks of age, right? And then
Mm.
over the next approximately 6 to 10 weeks, the software of the brain, if you like, is established. So all the connections are established, and that's why that period is so important, because the only way that those connections in the brain can actually develop is if the brain is challenged. So, for example, for the visual cortex to grow, so the visual cortex is back here at the back of the brain, for that to grow and develop, puppies must be exposed to visual interest, so it has to be challenged. For the auditory cortex is here, they must be exposed to interesting sounds. For the kind of frontal cortex, where thought and reasoning and impulsivity and all those sorts of things are controlled, we must have cognitive challenge. And this is the part of the brain that's really doing a ton of development during adolescence. And when the puppy brain is built and all those connections are formed, there's loads of extra neurons. And if they're not used up during puppyhood, as in they're not connected, they're not working, they're lost. It's a process referred to as neuronal pruning. And this happens during adolescence. And that means that they're gone. So if we don't get the puppy stuff right, we have less of a brain to work with in adolescence. So that puppy stuff is so important. But then once we get to adolescence, we have to start building that brain and maturing that brain. So the two periods work together so that the dog has some sort of a thinking machine when they get to adulthood, right? So that's what's happening. First of all, is this kind of frontal cortex is developing. And what that means is during this time, during this development, it means that this area isn't functioning really well as it should do. So I often kind of help to visualize this by saying, if we have some sort of roadworks going on a main artery road, that, there'll be lots of redirecting people, rerouting them, lots of diversions going around it. So while the frontal cortex is building, lots and lots of messages are going to be rerouted to the limbic system. And the limbic system is this middle part of the brain that lives in here. And the limbic system is really good at emotional kind of responses and emotional learning and emotional memories, which obviously are going to be relating to like stress, frustration, anger, happiness, all of the gamut of those emotional responses. And we often talk about teenagers, like teenage children, having strong swings in emotionality and emotional responses and things like that. And we have all sorts of terms and derogatory terms to describe that. But that's what's going on. It's going on, and it's not because they have any conscious control over this. It's because those messages that really should be making it eventually appear to where they can be thought out and sorted out and things like that really can't get that far while this is developing. And some days the brain is working and we're able to access this, and some days for a teenager it's not. So their behaviour appears unpredictable. It appears, we talk about mood swings, so it appears, from right up to right down and everything else in between very dramatically, and that's a big thing that's happening. So we have, the brain is telling us they need help with cognitive challenge. The brain is telling us that they're not well able to cope with swings in emotional responses because they do not have the hardware for that at this time. But also what's happening is the dopamine system is kicking in and really maturing, and that happens alongside the sex hormone system. So everybody's talking. And the dopamine system is really about seeking reinforcement, seeking reward, getting access to fun things. And what this means is that adolescent dogs are going to be seeking out more independence. They're going to be more interested in exploring their world. So it's not so cool when you're a teenager to be seen with your parents. So they'll be going further afield. They'll be going off doing their own thing. They'll also be seeking out social interactions. They're more socially motivated. They'll be, because they're preparing to make babies eventually. And it also means, because we discussed this too, but it also means that they're going to be far more interested in certain types of reinforcers than others, maybe not the ones we have that we think are going to work. And they're going to be less sensitive to aversive stimulation. So what that can often lead to then is it can lead to trainers and guardians upping the kind of physicality or the intimidation level of the use of aversive approaches to teaching dogs. And those teenagers are going to be, be less less responsive in terms of their learning. So there is a ton of brain stuff happening. It is not a quiet, peaceful passage for sure.
And I suppose this kind of goes into as well, many owners then notice that a well-behaved puppy in the past starts to ignore commands that they're being given, and I suppose they think the dog is being bold, or that title could be given to a dog, but in the end it's something very, very natural, right? You've just explained that it's helping them reach maturity, even sexual maturity, and that kind of
Absolutely.
side of things
Yeah.
as well.
This is it exactly. So we think our puppies are really well behaved because they kind of follow us around and the sun shines out of us, a little bit like toddlers, right? So they think we're
Hmm.
wonderful and everything we offer them is great fun, and we give they'll work for all sorts of things, and they'll, oh my goodness, it's a delight. And puppies are a delight. They're my favorite thing on the planet, puppies for sure. And then as they start to approach teething, so about 5.5 months, things start to change. The brain starts to change, the physical body starts to change, the responses to their environment starts to change, and of course their sex hormones start to talk to them as well. And so we thought that we didn't have to do any work with our puppy, and then adolescence strikes and hits us in the face, basically,
Hmm.
and we realize, oh right, yeah, okay, this is actually going to be quite challenging and a bit tough. The other thing we have to recognize here is that puppies, their communicative abilities are not mature. So we often presume that puppies are enjoying or fine or tolerant or comfortable with a particular situation, such as handling them, or bringing them to the vet or exposing them to other dogs, for example. And it's much harder to read puppy behaviour. But by the time they start to come into adolescence, their communicative abilities start to mature a little bit more, and their displeasure at something or their dislike for something becomes more obvious. And it's not that they were loving it before, it's that we become better at recognizing it, at recognizing their discomfort. So people will be shocked that their 6-month old adolescent, so they'll call them a puppy, but it's not, they're a teenager, that their 6-month old adolescent will suddenly growl at another dog or snark at somebody who's grooming them, for example. And it's quite likely that that puppy was showing discomfort earlier, but we didn't recognize it because we're just not as good at communicating that, and we weren't as good at recognizing it. And now all of a sudden they have new tools for expressing this, that are suddenly much more obvious to us, and that's what's been building. So for sure there can be some surprises coming your way as your puppy matures.
And actually, I wanted to stay on the line of their new tools, because I
Mhm.
think for anyone listening in, that has maybe a puppy that's going through the puppy stages and now getting slightly terrified that their dog might be entering teenagehood. Um, for our own Frenchie Ruby, it was actually probably overall a really, really positive experience, because she had been quite a shy puppy, and
Mhm.
we found ourselves always trying to encourage her and give her like confidence to explore the world, and which she did in her own little playful way. But during her teenage phase, we were kind of terrified as well, because we were saying, what's happening, our cute little passive puppy? But actually she got so much like sass and spring in her
Mhm.
step, and she started enjoying the world, and it was actually such a nice phase to see her come out of her shell and say, hello world, I'm here. So
Yeah.
it was such a really, really nice phase, actually. Obviously, there were some shocks in there, but I think we're very quick to always, jump to the problems, because particularly,
Mm.
I'm sure in your case, you see a lot of problem cases during this phase, but it can potentially be like something really, really nice, and to see a dog kind of coming into themselves a little bit.
Absolutely. And we will often see that in the behavioural histories of dogs. So puppies that were shy, as youngsters, and then around six, maybe 6 to 9 months, particularly in males and females as well. We just don't have, as there hasn't been as much interest in female specific development because most scientists are male, unsurprisingly. And they've led the discussion. But anyway, that's a podcast of a different nature, I feel. But definitely around between 6 and 9 months, when the sex hormones start to talk to them, their bits start to talk to them essentially, and they will get this little, a little bit more confidence. They will appear a little bit more likely to explore. And it's clear that you obviously were giving her a ton of support when she was younger, so that she felt able to do that, because just relying on those sex hormone changes probably won't be as great for you. The sex hormones don't always make us make good decisions, I'm going to say. They're
Yeah.
not always the
Mhm.
sensible hormones, right? Particularly testosterone. I mean, I call it the stupid hormone because,
Yeah.
because of all of it. Uh,
Yeah.
but but and there's big surges of testosterone in males between 6 and 9 months. Male dogs I'm talking about here, huge surges in testosterone. And if you've met a lot of male dogs between that age, you can kind of see it. It's it's not subtle, but it can definitely give them some confidence. It can definitely improve that. So I'm really happy to hear that helped Ruby,
Mm.
and really helped shape her brain. And one of the really important things about sex hormones is that they don't just ready the body for reproduction. They do that, but they also have protective effects in the brain, particularly testosterone. So it's particularly important in relation to protecting the brain from stress and trauma. And this is why women may be appear to be more susceptible to PTSD, for example, than men are. And the difference there is that testosterone and the protective effects of it. And I know you'll probably want to talk about neutering adolescent dogs, so we can definitely pick up on that too, because there are implications there for that, for sure.
Yeah, and maybe just to stick with generalizations, because we
Mhm.
love making generalizations and putting individuals into boxes that they
Mm.
may or may not want to be in. But like, do we see in general more, let's say, issues or maybe stronger indications of being in teenagehood between female dogs and male dogs, or is it are there different, let's say, issues through our human eyes, or challenges that are associated with the different genders?
I think what you've said there is absolutely correct, that behavior exists in the world because it's a response
Mm.
to the environment. How we view it as humans is the thing that's going to impact the welfare of our dogs most. So we tend to find the behaviors associated with this change in testosterone level in the male dog. We tend to find those change related behaviors to be less desirable on our part, even though they're a completely normal part of this development for dogs. And it's what they need to do, and they kind of need to go through some of this stuff and survive it out the other side so that their brain gets to mature with it and gets to experience it. But we tend to find it obnoxious, or we tend to find it undesirable. So for example, testosterone will do things like increase their social motivation, increase their interest in the opposite sex, increase the likelihood of them showing sexualized behaviors such as leg cocking and marking all of the vertical surfaces in the world. It's very
Mm.
important when you're just learning to cock your leg. They'll often start cocking their leg about 7 months of age, and it's like they suddenly realize this is the most amazing thing that's ever happened. Their little minds are blown, and they're like lifting their leg on all sorts of things, going, "Look at me!" And it's a huge deal for them. It's obviously a very important rite of passage for boy dogs, and bitches will cock as well. So bitches kind of hitch
Mhm.
up as well, and
Yeah.
that can absolutely be driven by sex hormones as well as they come into adolescence. But again, it's how we view it, right? So for
Mhm.
dogs, it's perfectly normal for them to mark vertical things, right? But we don't like them to do that in certain places. So our expectations is, well, you can do that here out in the grass or on the trees or whatever, but you can't do it here on the soft furnishings, on my shopping bags, on my jacket, and that kind of thing, right? So, and what are dogs supposed to do with this? They don't know. These are arbitrary rules, so they don't know what the difference between those things are, particularly when you're a youngster just working out the wonders of cocking your leg. But it will also drive other things as well, including aggression and same-sex competition. So they're competing for access to the ladies. So they might be likely to spar a little bit more with males, local males. They'll spar with them a little bit more. And this is because they're preparing for when there will be real contests, and they want to get to know this guy and whether, how physical he is, how strong he is, how well he understands the social rules and how we go about competing, and that kind of stuff. So there'll be a lot more of that happening. Young males will also get a lot more hassle from older and established males. And it's a bit of, back in your box now, young fella. Just because testosterone is suddenly talking to you doesn't mean you get to, throw your weight around too much. And that's actually really important for their development. But think of all the ways we would go about preventing that from happening, or not even being aware that these are things that are important to happen. And also, it's really difficult to do it carefully because our expectations of dogs is such that they never get to show aggressive responding. They never get to do normal dog stuff that we find unattractive or undesired, and things like that. So it's really difficult for dogs. And I do feel that the changes that are associated with testosterone tend to be less desirable to humans, and as such, that tends to make them less acceptable, even though they're as normal as the changes females will go through and as expected, and they have to do it because they don't really have any choice. It tends to be via our lens. So I think your qualification of that is correct.
And I think, like down that train of thought as well, a lot of the things that might not be acceptable, like you say, for like cocking the leg or whatever it happens, or a snarl at another
Hmm.
dog, you know, in your local espresso bar, is going to be really unacceptable. Whereas if you imagined exactly that same situation out in their world, or their in a world appropriate for them, like off leash in a forest, let's say, where there's
Yeah.
nobody else, no humans around,
Yeah.
just them and a couple of other dogs, you'd be like, oh look, it's peeing against a tree. Who cares? You know,
Mm.
you'd find it so socially acceptable that a dog is doing that. It's
Hmm.
just when you're trying to apply their behavior to our world, it
Yeah.
just doesn't really marry very well,
Yeah.
right?
Exactly. And the responsibility then for us is to be aware of what those distinctions are and make sure our dog does develop the skills so that they can straddle both worlds. And this is a real challenge for dogs. They have to be super cool in the dog world and super cool in the human world. And the human world is really challenging because the expectations are so unrealistic. So it's a very, very challenging time for dogs. And why I kind of emphasize that we need to kind of focus more on adolescence is because we need to remember that adolescent dogs are vulnerable. Most dogs that are relinquished, find themselves in shelters, pounds, rescues, are about 2 years of age. Right. And the other startling bit of data that we have is that the most common cause of euthanasia in dogs under the age of 3 is behavioural euthanasia. And that means that adolescent dogs, largely due to their behaviour, which is totally normal, natural, and necessary for them, means that they become unwanted very, very quickly at this most vulnerable time in their lives. So moving them from the only safety they've ever known, from their established home and relationships, breaking those relationships down, moving them to somewhere where they're probably going to live in an under-enriched environment in terms of, outside of a family home and like a kennel or shelter environment, this is going to have potentially traumatic effects on their brain that's going to impact them throughout adulthood. And that then can lead to their death before they even get the opportunity to become behaviourally mature. Adolescent dogs are the most vulnerable dogs we deal with, and as such require so much extra care.
Mhm. Yeah, and it really hits home that, you know, this is really important to
Mm-hmm.
at least try to get right. I mean, you know, we can't all get everything right all the
Nope.
time, and I think that has to be okay.
Oh yeah.
But you know, like there have to be outlets as well where we have understanding for a dog. And maybe, do you think that maybe getting our dogs out into those more natural settings during teenage time, where we are more prone to be acceptable of their
Yeah.
behaviors, do you
Yeah,
think
for
that could
sure.
be an
Yeah,
aid?
for sure. Like I think that definitely what's happened is the more we've moved dogs away from a more natural kind of
Hmm.
surroundings, and we have to remember that domestic dogs are not a natural animal, right?
Hmm.
All of the shapes and sizes and hair and colors and all of those variations are as a result of selective breeding, and have been very much shaped in images that we want to see, and less emphasis has been put on their behavioral abilities, particularly in relation to resilience and stress recovery, and being somewhat more straightforward during adolescence. Wouldn't that be a target for breeding, right? Wouldn't
Hmm.
that be a way to select for, from individuals, breed from individuals that were pretty straightforward during adolescence? That way we could immediately start to reduce the number of dogs unwanted, killed via behavioral euthanasia. Like that would be a thing if we could get some sort of consensus there. But again, that'd be another podcast, I feel, doing that. But, and because we've moved more and more away from dogs kind of having control over what happens to them. So what happened in the 90s here was leash laws came in. The Control of Dogs Act was amended, and it meant that dogs could no longer roam at will. They had to be kept on their humans' property. And also what kind of happened around this time as well was that women started to go back to work. And I'm all for women going back to work. I'm a woman who works and has been working since then as well. But what it meant was that dogs were now socially isolated from the world in back gardens or houses without anybody else home for extended periods of time. So our efforts to help dogs live a more dog life have become more and more contrived, and everything has to be done through us. So dogs live in an environment that's enriched to suit humans, and yet we expect them to just slot in with that. And I think that's I think adolescence is when we see those biggest clashes, because that's exactly when dogs need to have a little bit more control over what happens to them, a little bit more access to that kind of exploration, to get to work out the world a little bit on their own, a little bit more cognitive challenge. And sometimes that means that that has to be done a little bit removed from their humans. We can't really replicate this for them. They have to experience this a little bit. And it's finding the balance between allowing that to happen safely and appropriately, but also making sure that they get to do it a little bit. So I would be all for reducing how contrived the activities we try to develop for our adolescent dogs, well, for any dog, but we're talking about teenagers right now, so specifically for adolescent dogs. Yeah, so for sure. And that doesn't mean that we just let them loose and they become a total nuisance, because teenagers given full rein of any species will not make good decisions. I mean, again, remember that this part of the brain is not on their side and is not working really to its full, capacity. So they still need guidance. And one of the most important things that we need to do for teenagers is have really good management in place. And what that means, preventing them putting in situations where they are going to get hooked on and get a strong reinforcement history for undesirable behavior, because that's what's developing at this time. And they'll get hooked on these behaviors that are, really about them seeking out a bit of a high. So think of the extra risk taking we would associate with teenage children, right? Jumping off walls into canals and speeding around in vehicles and all those sorts of things. And that comes again from this lack of kind of maturity of the frontal cortex. And so young dogs are going to be similar. They're going through a similar thing, and they will take extra risk taking behavior, and they get a bit of a high from that, a bit of an endorphin release from that. And they're all about that, of course. Who isn't? So that means that we want to be really careful and make sure that they're getting those jollies in acceptable ways, and we're not setting ourselves up for real difficulty through maturity.
I was going to say, could we bring some fun into this? Is this a great time to consider, new types of enriching play, be that kind of tug toys? And obviously you don't want to do the same thing. I don't want to encourage anyone to start a repetitive, slightly obsessive behavior. But, all sorts of different types of things, from your different toys to balls to, playing chase or whatever it happens to be. Is it a good time to introduce new, fun, Absolutely. Safe activities?
So much play. And the thing is that this surge in sex hormones also has an impact on appetite. So they can become less food motivated. They can eat a little bit less. And also we're competing with the smells of wee and all other, all the other dogs and things like that. So food, which we may have been using really successfully with our puppies to work on, to reinforce engagement and things like that, and really successfully, that kind of tends to lose a little bit of its appeal. But what comes into adolescence now is they love to seek out physical movement. Not just brain development is happening, not just hormonal development is happening during adolescence. Their body is moving. And if you look at puppies walking around, they're a little bit like drunken sailors, right? And we kind of say the puppies are made out of rubber a little bit, because they spend a lot of time falling over themselves and their feet Tumbling. Are too big. Yeah. And it's adorable, right? But as they come into their adolescent body, they start to grow their legs, their muscles start to develop. And for that to happen, so the brain and body, the dog's behavior is always telling us what the dog needs. So when we look at adolescent dogs, and even if you look at teenage children, they're much more physical. They're running around, they're moving around much more. That tells us that that's what they need at this time. So our teenage dogs need more activity, more physical movement, all of that kind of stuff. They absolutely do. And we can kind of help shape that by using play and chasing and lots of engagement and interaction and all of those sorts of things. It is definitely super important that they have outlets for that physicality. And I mean, one of the things, the two most common behaviors that tend to happen in adolescence that are my least favorite dog behaviors. So I have behaviors that I cannot stand, and that is body slamming and hard mouthing, which are really super associated with adolescent dogs, and they love to jump into you and like slam their chest into their hip off you as they move around you and grab some part of you and mouth. And people think that puppy nipping is bad, and I'm like, oh god, wait for adolescent mouthing, just wait for the bruising. And that comes from that desire to like get to move around. But we do have to be careful. And so one of the ways that I like to illustrate this for people is this concept of roller coasters. So if we bring them up, we need to introduce things that help them to come down, and then bring them up again, up, down, up, down. And what that does is that primes their biological stress systems to become better able to recover from stress. But we sometimes have to kind of facilitate that and kind of supervise it a little bit, because the teenager is not good at overcoming that. So if they get overwhelmed, they find it really difficult to come down again. They find that really, really hard to kind of bring themselves down again. And again, remember when we were teenagers, if we had any upset, I mean, it was just, full on drama before we were, able to recover and move on from it. It really felt like the worst thing in the world had happened. And, very little perspective, I suppose, at that stage. So I think your idea of like introducing games like tug and chasing and all of those things, that's a really good idea. And to really emphasize those and make them so that your dog gets to get their kind of physical jollies, but then make sure that if we bring them up with all of that excitement, or if they're up themselves, because let's face it, teenagers spend a bit of time up there, we then have to have a kind of a wind down routine to help them come down. So we can't expect them to go from full on tug to resting peacefully in one stage. That's just not within their wherewithal at all. So we need to think about, okay, well, what's the next level of activity down? So maybe we'll do some really active sniffing. Then we might do some tugging and to bring them up a little bit, and then some active sniffing, and then we might do some chewing to bring them down again, and then so to gradually have this kind of step-by-step kind of wind down routine. So if we're going to increase that physicality, and we need to introduce more opportunities for them to do that, we also need to make sure that we have it balanced with a suitable wind down routine that's going to help them come down as well. For sure.
And and that really links to what I was also just about to ask as well about boundaries, because obviously there are going to be times where they kind of overstep the mark when they're challenging everything. Are these wind down routines then kind of linked to that as well, where you're saying, okay, this is not where we want to go now?
Yeah, so I think less about it as them challenging boundaries, because that's not really what they're doing. There's no conscious defiance or anything like that happening, particularly not for dogs anyway, because they just don't have the complexity. They're they live a lovely, simple life, which is why they're so pleasant to be around. And I would choose 100 canine teenagers over one human teenager any day for that exact reason, for sure. Slightly simpler outlook. So what tends to happen though is, I think, when we start to use labels like that, and labels like boisterous come up a lot with adolescent defiance comes up, challenging boundaries comes up, stubborn will come up. These are commonly used to describe failings in our setup and in our expectations of what is normal as part of these behavior phase changes, right? So I tend to think less about that and go, okay, well, why are they doing this behavior? What do they get out of this behavior? How does this behavior function for them? And if we have a somewhat understanding of what the brain is going through and the body is going through, we can start to see that teenagers are doing things because they need to, they're seeking sensation. They're seeking interaction with their world, because their brain is saying, you need to go out and find out how that works. You need to go out and seek out that challenge, so that grows your brain. So when we start to consider it from that point of view, those labels become less useful, and we start to say, okay, well, what can I change in this world to help them better be able to manage this? So if we have behaviors such as, so that we might label challenging the boundary, so that might include things like they might pull on lead a little bit more. They might be more likely to counter surf. So let's have a think about this. Why are these behaviors commonly discussed in relation to adolescent dogs? Well, first of all, they're physically more capable. They're cognitively more capable, so they can work out how to get up on that counter. So you had this tiny puppy with legs that weren't really super coordinated. So you think you can leave your toast out there on the counter. The adolescent with their big long legs and massively increased musculature can now get up on those hind legs, get on that counter, reach your toast, eat it before you even knew any of this happened, of course, as well. And the same with pulling on lead or not recalling. All of this can be linked to those normal changes. So if we can predict that these things are going to happen, we can prevent those behaviours ever becoming an issue. So we're not going to leave our toast up on the counter. We're going to make sure that our dog gets to be on a long line, for example, and gets to go to places where they're safe, as independently as possibly exploring and things like that to meet those jollies. So I would say, instead of coming at it again from our very human lens, into this idea that that teenagers are doing these things because they're it's deliberate almost. And we even have a little bit of data in relation to this, that one of the things that happens during adolescence, which further increases the vulnerability of our teenage dogs, is that not only are the adolescent dogs changing, but so are the attitudes of guardians. So if you look at cute little round puppies, oh my God, I just want to squish them, absolutely gorgeous. And that exact cuteness, that exact physiology elicits all sorts of caregiving behaviour from humans, which is why we like puppies. Why I love puppies so much. But think about what happens to the adolescent. They start to grow longer, and they're often kind of out of kilter, aren't they? They kind of have a long face and still have short, everything is a bit at odds with its
huge paws.
Everything else. And this, plus the passage of time, changes the expectations of the humans. So humans are less likely to find their adolescent dog as cute. So there's less eliciting of that caregiving behaviour by default from humans. And as well as that, time has gone by, and we kind of expect, okay, you're supposed to be a grown-up dog now. You look more grown-up, so why aren't you just like my last dog, who I remember as a 15-year-old, or whatever it is. So that increases the vulnerability, because our attitudes to adolescence change. And also think of our adolescence in our society to young people. So think of the kind of weaponizing of terms that are used to describe young people. So the term youths is used a lot in media to describe so-called, kind of children who are showing, social irresponsibility or whatever. Like, these are children. These are children with brains that don't function like adults, that don't have that capability, and that don't have a lot of opportunities in the world, because it's incredibly hostile to them. And it's exactly the same for our pet dogs. So our attitude to human teenagers may have, is similar to our attitude to canine teenagers as well, and the same vulnerabilities exist, across the board. So there is a lot of similarities there across those species and those relationships that are in fact affecting adolescent animals of all of the species, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I suppose like everything you're saying is kind of really pointing the direction of set your dog up for success, really, isn't it? It's and even in saying that, it's like what you're really saying when you say set your dog up for success is look at the world from your dog's perspective, really understand, because their success is only going to be through what's available to them, so it's really, really interesting. Yeah. And when we look at all of this together, then, because it's quite a complex time, as you've demonstrated, are there specific training methods that might work a little bit better during this phase, as opposed to, say, when you're talking about training with puppies or training with adult dogs?
So I don't tend to put that much distinction between what we do with puppies and what we do with adolescents, because I want the same focus to be, on what we do with our adolescent dogs. That puppy training doesn't end with puppyhood, right? So that there should be this kind of continuation of those same efforts, right? We tend to get into teenage training, and suddenly it's all about obedience and all of these sorts of things. And even a lot of the terms that come up in relation to training our adolescent dogs, so you'll see a lot about us having to train for so-called impulse control, or frustration tolerance is a new one that we see everywhere right now. And the thing is that our adolescent's brain, their behaviour is telling us they're not able to tolerate frustration terribly well, because, again, this thing here, they're not able to control their impulsivity terribly well. So why then are we putting such an emphasis on something that they're not able to do? And then when they don't do it because our expectations are unrealistic, then we reach for stronger aversives, more intimidation, increased coercion. And those things are things that are definitely not going to help our adolescent dog, because our adolescent brain is much more susceptible to damage by social stress during adolescence than it was during puppyhood. So doing that sort of stuff, exerting strong aversive approaches, particularly in terms of kind of social interactions that we might use, we're big fans as humans of suppressing behavior. So we really think that if a dog isn't doing behavior, that we have somehow won, that that's some sort of success. But actually the suppression of behavior is relatively easy in dogs. They're easy to intimidate. And they're easy to intimidate because we've selected for that. We've selected for them to take our human awfulness, right? And yeah, we're terrible as a species. So we have to be really careful with this, because remember, everything that our adolescent dog goes through right now has an impact later on. So we don't necessarily see the results of that until later on. And the other thing, remember, about this kind of swelling of this and development of this dopamine system, and that makes them appear less sensitive to aversive control. But what it's doing is it means that guardians think that they have to, or trainers think that they have to ramp up the aversive, so we have to pile it on even more to suppress behaviour. And then that damage is going to be seen in the adult dog later on. So not only is it impacting their brain development, but it's impacting the relationship between those people and their dogs too.
And I suppose you touched already on complex emotions as well that dogs cannot feel. So it might be worthwhile as well reiterating here that your dog is not acting out of spite.
No.
It's unlikely that they've got this plan to break you emotionally or whatever it is. Like they just haven't sat down and built out a blueprint for this. It's like they've relatively simple emotions, right?
Yeah, I mean, we don't actually know, right?
Yeah,
And even when
yeah.
we start to talk about human behavior, there are something like 100 and something different definitions of emotion across the literature. This is not settled at all. And we have no understanding of how another species, or even how another person, would experience that. We can somewhat guess, because I'm going to assume you as a human have similar equipment to me, have similar way of using that. It's set up probably similarly. But the problem with the brain, or not the problem, but the thing about the brain is that it has been uniquely shaped in your body via your experiences since conception, and it's been uniquely shaped in my body via via different experiences since conception. So it's going to be the same for our dogs, and for us to be, I don't know, kind of the arrogant humans that we tend to be, and we tend to be so anthropocentric and believe that, well, if I'm experiencing it this way, well, obviously dogs are as well. And we don't know. fMRI that's looked, functional MRI that's looked at dog stuff hasn't really given us any good concrete information for various reasons. And again, it could be another podcast. I mean, we do a whole course on this. It hasn't really given us good information. But what we can do is we can assess the animal's attitude to their world via observable behaviour. So we can look and see what they're doing, and we have some understanding, and not from dogs, to be perfectly honest with you, about what happens in the adolescent brain, and what happens during this time. And we think that there are enough similarities between the development across many mammal species that we can extrapolate with that. And we can go, okay, well, this is happening in the brain. They don't really have any control over that. It's unlikely that dogs are experiencing complex social emotions to the same degree that humans might. But we don't have concrete evidence that tells us that. This does not mean that dogs are just automates. Dogs are absolutely wonderfully sensitive, sentient creatures who are just uninhibited in their world, which is certainly why I love them so much. I look at them navigating the human world in a way that I would never get away with, right? And doing things that I would never be able to, with such glee and pure glee. Not affected by humility, or not affected with, what are they going to think about me, or anything like that. It's just this wonderful carefree existence that they appear to, show, which I hope is what they're experiencing, or what I want them to experience, I suppose, for them. So I would tend to try to not get too bogged down in understanding their experience in a way that isn't observable, because I could fill in any gaps, and you can fill in whatever gaps you want, and somebody else, they've already filled in all those gaps. So instead I might go, okay, well, look at what age you are, look at how you're responding to this situation, and I might label it, oh, you're responding, with behavior, right? Or you appear frustrated. And instead I might go, well, what are you getting out of this? What are the barriers in terms of you being able to cope with this? And if the dog is showing frustration related behavior, that is telling us that they are not capable of frustration tolerance in this setup. That is all the information we need to know. You are not able to stand patiently, or what we're calling patiently, but stand still, comfortably, loosely, while I open a door, while it takes 5 more seconds for me to get a key and open a door, rather than jumping at the door or barking or something that we'll label as frustration. But really, what the dog is doing is they're doing behaviour that's worked. If they're jumping at the door and barking at the door, and this has led to the door opening before, yeah, they're going to do that again. We've taught them to do this. We've taught them that, don't wait. Jump around like a beluga and we'll let you out the door, no problem. So I tend to get less worried about what they could be feeling, because again, I can, via my human lens, I can, infect them with all sorts of human awfulness that way. And more going, more looking at what they're doing, what they're able to do, and what their behaviour is telling me about how they're dealing with that situation. And it takes a little bit of a mind shift to start to do that, because it's not our natural tendency as humans. Our natural tendency is to anthropomorphize them.
Yeah.
Which isn't completely incorrect either. So, it's hard. It's tough.
It's a complex world, but it keeps it interesting. So we've been through kind of the whole roller coaster ride about teenage dogs and the ups and downs, and how it can have positives and maybe some more challenges. Maybe there's a couple of people listening in that are thinking, I'm starting to feel like I'm struggling a bit. Mm-hmm. What would be your most important advice to those people?
The first thing would be to get help. This is completely normal and to be expected. You thought puppyhood was challenging. You ain't seen nothing yet, love. So I would love pet owners to be ready to go with adolescence. So, we've definitely seen an increase in people understanding that their puppy is going to need puppy school, and that their puppy is going to need, I suppose, junior education. But stopping there is like stopping in senior infants in school, right? We still have to get them through the whole rest of it, which is the really fun part. And again, there needs to be more and more focus on adolescence. So get some help. Make sure that we're emphasizing management. Make sure we're emphasizing relationship-based work that's going to improve your relationship with your dog, and also acceptance. It is going to be strained for a couple of years. Thankfully, canine adolescence does not go on for like over a decade like it does with children. You'll be happy to hear, right? So it starts around teething time, around 5.5 months. It's the worst of it is to about 2. And it starts to even out after that till about 3, and we start to hit social maturity. If you can survive that with good management in place, continue with relationship building exercises, and making sure that your adolescent dog is getting to do the behaviours that they need to do. Their body is telling you what they're needing to do. Their brain is telling you what they're needing to do. If you can do those things, you will survive it. You might be a shell of the person you once were, but you will survive it. You will get through it, and it will be worth it. Putting the work in during puppyhood and during adolescence is worth it, because you come out with this wonderful companion out the other side in adulthood. And I'll tend to kind of emphasize to people that your adolescent dog isn't giving you a hard time. They're having a hard time, for sure.
Yeah.
And if we can emphasize that, and like saying to a person that this is normal, that they're having a hard time, that might not be of great comfort to you when you're in the thick of it. But do know that this is normal. It's not because you've messed up. It's not because you've done terrible things, or you've done the wrong thing, or you've not done something, or anything like that. It's not about blame. It's normal to expect a blip now. And get help. We can help you, and we'll all survive it. We will survive it, I promise.
And I love that. I'd love to underline that as well. The fact that, like, in Ireland we have so many amazing professionals that can help you, and it's like you're probably doing like 99% of things right, and there's 1 or 2 bits of challenge that maybe you haven't tackled yet, and it's just about getting that right, and you could have an amazing relationship with your dog for the rest of their lives. So it's like it's a no-brainer. Once you've done it, it's a no-brainer. If you're confused about it and stressed and struggling, it's probably not a no-brainer. But once you've done it, you'll be like, wow, that really changed everything.
Yeah. For sure. And you will look back at this phase and you will laugh about it, for sure. And we will get to that point. It doesn't feel like it now, but you will. You will get
Yeah,
there.
definitely,
Yeah.
definitely. Keep going. So
Yes.
thank you so, so much, Anne, for
Well,
coming on
thank
and
you.
joining us on the podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure as always. And I look forward to
Thank
seeing
you
you
so
again very
much.
soon.
Yeah. See you
Thank
soon.
you. See you. Once again, a huge thank you to Anne for coming on and joining us on the podcast this week. And thank you for listening in. We would also like to thank you in advance for you popping into our show notes and checking out the social media pages and the websites for Annie Ed, for Ruby Reese, and for dognutrition.ie. We appreciate all of your social followings. We appreciate when you get comments up there and get interacting with us. Social media is all about being social, and I know that Anne fully agrees with that as well. So get posting, get following, and get chatting with us, because we love to hear from you. Wishing you a lovely week and looking forward to seeing you again next week for another podcast episode.